Nonviolence section. Ethic of Conviction and Ethic of Responsibility. We have hitherto moved at the level of explicit declarations, of loud, clear stances in favor of this or that form of violence, e.g., during the First World War, for military violence, as in the case of socialists of a patriotic persuasion and Gandhi himself, or for revolutionary violence, as was the case with Liebknecht, Luxemburg, and the Bolsheviks. That is to say, we have proceeded on the basis of the express intentions of the protagonists. If we now examine things with reference to the ethic of responsibility, the inevitability of violence on the occasion of major historical crises becomes even more evident. In the years preceding the American Civil War, the militants of the nonviolent abolitionist movement could condemn the use of violence in perfect good faith. However, in depicting the institution of slavery and slave owners in the darkest colors, they ended up fueling the storm that issued in the showdown between North and South and the abolitionist revolution. It has legitimately been observed that Garrison, quote, more than any other American of his time, was responsible for the atmosphere of moral absolutism which caused the Civil War and freed the slaves. End quote. In other words, while from the standpoint of the ethic of intentions, the champion of the nonviolent movement assumed blame for the violence starting with his declared support for the Union's war, from the standpoint of the ethic of responsibility, he had, in a sense, already betrayed the principle sincerely professed by him. In Italy, Capitini proved conscious of this paradox when interrogating himself about his agitation against the fascist regime. Quote, however did I, who spoke and wrote of nonviolence, find myself inciting and guiding anti-fascism in so many young people, which led them to become partisans in the armed struggle? End quote. When we switch from the ethic of conviction to the ethic of responsibility, violence even ends up manifesting itself in the everyday practice of nonviolence, independently of the occurrence of major historical crises. This applies to Garrison as well as Gandhi. There is no doubt that the latter intended to avoid violence in challenging the imperial government. But let us see the attitude he adopted in 1942, when he prompted the largest campaign of civil disobedience ever launched by him, at a time when, on account of the Second World War and the Japanese military offensive, a harsh reaction was foreseeable from the British, who now had their backs against the wall. The Indian leader knew very well that the struggle would be extremely bitter, but did not become circumspect on this account. On the contrary, he spurred on his followers and compatriots to open rebellion with the motto, "Do or die," and called on them to engage solemnly and publicly in developing agitation and a mass movement for which they must be ready to give their lives in order to put an end to the country's slavery. In theory, the instruction of nonviolence remained in place, but it was not difficult to foresee the sequel. The demonstrators set fire to hundreds of police barracks, post offices, and railway stations, while disorder and clashes led to the death and wounding of around 2,500 people. It was the, quote, most serious rebellion since 1857, that is, since the Sepoys Mutiny, and the specter of such a rebellion was all the more credible because in 1942, as in 1857, there were Indian military units that refused to obey orders from British officers and proved inclined to mutiny. If we apply the ethic of responsibility, it is difficult to ignore Gandhi's role in this turn of events. In fact, he ends up being doubly implicated. On the one hand, he may be regarded as jointly responsible for the bloodshed that occurred in India during the violent protests. On the other, with his open rebellion, he kept, quote, more than 50 battalions of British and Indian troops stuck on the Indian border, thus removing them from the fight against Japan, which could exact a heavier price in blood on the enemy army. Finally, we know that in Gandhi, exposure to the adversary's violence, and provocation of it even, were essential to generate the moral indignation required to give impetus to nonviolent action and make it irresistible. But does this not mean making oneself jointly responsible for the adversary's violence? This was the criticism made of King in 1963 by ministers of the white churches in Birmingham. Yet he followed a much more cautious line than Gandhi in this respect. End section.